An 89-year-old man was humiliated when he asked for a simple sandwich at a cafe. Shocked, a wealthy woman noticed something on his wrist and froze. As she got closer and saw what it was, her face went blank. Before the story, leave a comment below letting us know which city you're watching from. Enjoy the video. The bell hanging on the cafe door chimed, softly echoing through the room as Robert entered, almost like an intruder amidst the indifferent routine of the other customers. It was early afternoon. The sun timidly filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the tables, but nothing seemed to warm the tired and worn expression on the face of the 89-year-old man. His steps were slow and dragging, and his eyes, though kind, showed the exhaustion of someone carrying decades of stories and burdens. He approached the counter and, with a weak and trembling voice, ordered a simple sandwich, almost as if he was asking for permission to exist in that place. Maria, the owner of the cafe, glanced at him impatiently. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and a constant air of dissatisfaction. She sighed and responded coldly, barely hiding her disdain. "Is that all? Do you have money to pay?" The question came out laced with suspicion, as if she was ready to deny the request at the slightest hint of hesitation. Robert nodded and began rummaging through the pockets of his worn-out coat, pulling out a few faded coins. Meanwhile, some of the other customers watched the scene with amused and disdainful looks. Malicious whispers and chuckles echoed through the cafe, but no one bothered to hide their indifference. The scene might have gone unnoticed, just another episode of silent cruelty that happens daily if it weren't for Laura. Sitting at a table near the window, she watched everything closely. Something about the way Robert was treated disturbed her deeply. Laura was a woman who exuded elegance. Her movements were graceful and precise, and she had a gaze that seemed to see through people, as if she could decipher their stories just by observing their gestures. Seeing how Robert was treated, she stood up and walked over to the counter with firm steps, never taking her eyes off Maria. "I'll pay for his sandwich," she said, placing a bill on the counter. Her voice was calm, but carried a tone that allowed no argument. Maria hesitated for a moment, surprised by the intervention, but she took the money and prepared the order without saying anything else. Robert looked at Laura, his eyes misty with gratitude, and offered a shy, almost embarrassed smile. "Thank you, miss," he murmured, his voice so soft that it seemed like the words might dissolve in the air. I didn't want to be a bother." Laura smiled back, a gentle and welcoming smile. "It's no bother at all," she replied. "Sometimes we just need a little kindness." The two sat down, and as Robert savored his sandwich, Laura observed every detail. It was then that she noticed something that made her stop for a moment, as if time had frozen. On Robert's wrist, an old and well-preserved watch glinted softly under the cafe's light. The simple yet elegant design was unmistakable. Laura felt a pang in her chest, a wave of emotions she hadn't expected. She recognized that watch. She had given one just like it to Vincent years ago, when they were still making plans for a future together. The memory of Vincent flashed through her mind like lightning. His warm smile, his whispered promises during quiet nights, and the tragedy that had ended everything so abruptly. With a trembling hand, Laura pointed to the watch. "That watch? Where did you get it?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but unable to hide the unease that was taking over her. Robert looked at the watch on his wrist, his wrinkled fingers gently caressing the surface of the metal, as if it were a precious treasure. "It was my son's," he replied, with a distant look, lost in memories. "Vincent. He gave it to me before he left." The name hit her like a blow, piercing through Laura and leaving her breathless for a moment. Vincent. The same Vincent she had loved, the man who had been the center of her life and whom she had lost so tragically. Her heart raced, and a mix of emotions, sadness, shock, hope, swirled inside her chest. "Vincent was your son?" She could barely get the words out, as if each one weighed a ton. Robert nodded, confused by her reaction but still sincere. "Yes, my son. God rest his soul." His eyes filled with tears as he spoke, and his voice broke. He was everything to us, and losing him destroyed us. For a moment, Laura was silent. Her face had gone pale, her eyes fixed on the man in front of her, as if she was trying to piece together a puzzle she hadn't even known existed until that moment. "I knew Vincent," she said finally, her voice choked. I loved him." Robert's eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped in the café. The people around them went on with their lives, unaware of the encounter taking place at that table, but for Robert and Laura, the world had changed. It was as if an invisible bridge had formed between them, connecting their pains and memories in an unexpected and painful bond. Laura felt tears burning in her eyes, but forced a smile. "And he was my reason too." The words came out with a bittersweet tenderness, and she felt the pain of all the unfulfilled promises, of all the moments they hadn't been able to live together. But there, in front of that man who carried the same weight of loss, she felt something new, an understanding, a solidarity she hadn't expected to find. The revelation transformed the atmosphere of the café, creating a space heavy with unspoken emotions. Laura realized that somehow fate had brought together two broken hearts. The watch, which once symbolized the love she and Vincent had shared, was now a link that connected her to Robert, the father who had also endured an irreplaceable loss. Without saying another word, she reached out and took Robert's hand, feeling the fragility and warmth of his fingers. Silence filled the streets as Laura and Robert left the café. Both were lost in thought, still trying to process the unexpected meeting and the revelations that had surfaced. Laura suggested they go to a nearby park, a quiet place away from prying eyes. Robert nodded in agreement, following her steps in silence, as if searching for the words to express the avalanche of emotions that overwhelmed him. The park was nearly empty, with only a few leaves falling from the trees and a light breeze that seemed to murmur ancient secrets. They sat on a wooden bench, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Laura observed Robert's face, trying to read every line, every mark of pain that time had left. Finally, she broke the silence. "I never thought I'd find someone who could understand what I'm feeling," Laura said, her voice soft and introspective. "Losing Vincent. It was like losing a part of me that I'll never be able to recover." Robert looked at her, his eyes tired but gentle. "You were important to him," he said with a sad serenity. "He spoke of you as someone who brought light into his life, something that maybe Cecilia and I couldn't do anymore." Laura was taken aback. She hadn't known that Vincent had shared so much about her with his parents, especially considering what she was about to discover. She remained silent for a moment, trying to gather the courage to ask about the life Vincent had left behind. "And you? What was it like for you before he was gone?" she asked cautiously, knowing she was touching on open wounds. Robert sighed deeply, as if gathering all his strength to speak. "It was hard," he began, his voice heavy with sadness. "Vincent was our only son. Cecilia and I always tried to give him the best, but in the last few years things got complicated. He drifted away. He spent more time away from home, and the conversations we had were filled with silences that said more than any words could." Robert paused, his eyes lost in the distance. "I didn't understand why he was so distant. But now, after hearing you speak, I'm beginning to see that maybe there were things I never knew." Laura felt a pang in her heart. She knew what Robert was referring to. Vincent had shared his conflicts and fears with her, the feeling of being suffocated by expectations he thought he could never meet. He wanted to find his own path, she said, choosing her words carefully. We had plans. We wanted to build something together, away from everything that seemed to be holding him back. But then, that accident happened. Laura's words brought back painful memories. For a moment, she could see Vincent smile again, hear his laughter echoing, and remember the dreams they had shared in long talks during the night. I never knew what to do with this pain, she admitted, her voice choked. I tried to move on, but it always felt like part of me was stuck on that day, in that moment when everything fell apart. Robert listened in silence, absorbing every word. He knew exactly what it was like to be trapped in a moment that could never be changed. After we lost Vincent, Cecilia and we lost each other too. She was devastated. There wasn't a single day when she didn't cry. And I felt powerless, unable to fix anything. He wiped his eyes, as if trying to hold back the tears that were beginning to surface. She couldn't cope with the loss. She ended up leaving our home and never came back. Laura looked at him, surprised. She left? Robert nodded, his face marked by the pain of years of memories. Cecilia never accepted Vincent's death. She blamed him for drifting away from the family, and when he was gone, the blame turned on herself. She couldn't stay in the house where everything reminded her of our son. So she went out into the streets, as if trying to escape everything, even herself. The revelation left Laura speechless for a few moments. She imagined a mother destroyed, lost in grief and despair, unable to find peace. The thought of Cecilia wandering the streets while Robert struggled to survive alone deeply disturbed her. And you? How did you manage to keep going? Robert shrugged, a small, resigned gesture. I don't know if I did, he admitted. I just kept going. When Cecilia left, I thought I might follow her, that I might lose myself too. But I knew that somehow I had to be around, in case she decided to come back. I never left the house, even if it meant living alone with all those ghosts. And every day, I waited. Robert's words, though simple, carried immense weight. He was a man who had remained standing out of sheer stubbornness, out of a hope that never completely faded, even though each passing day seemed to dim his light a little more. Laura felt a deep respect for this man and the pain he bore so silently. And now, more than ever, she felt that she needed to do something, even if she didn't quite know what. Robert, she began, hesitating, if I could, I would like to help. Not just you, but Cecilia too. I know it might be too late, but I can't ignore what I'm feeling. Vincent meant everything to me, and if there's any way to ease the pain you're feeling, I want to try. Robert looked at her with a mix of surprise and hope. You'd do that, even knowing that Cecilia might not want your help. I know she might blame me for what happened, and I accept that, Laura replied, her voice determined but full of compassion. But I also know that Vincent wouldn't want to see his mother suffering like this, and if there's anything I can do to change that, then I need to try. Robert was silent for a moment, absorbing the sincerity in Laura's words. He knew that Cecilia still harbored a lot of hurt, but Laura's willingness to face it and try to help was something he hadn't expected. Cecilia is a strong woman, he said finally, but sometimes even the strongest need help. And there, on that park bench, something began to change. Two people who had been separated by the same tragedy now found themselves united, not just by the love they had for Vincent, but by the will to overcome the pain and find a path to healing. Laura didn't know what the meeting with Cecilia would be like, but she was determined to do whatever it took. She reached out and took Robert's hand, and he gently squeezed it, a gesture of support and acceptance. In that moment, amid the park's silence, they made a silent promise. It wouldn't be an easy journey, and the wounds were still open, but they were willing to take the first step. And that, for both of them, was already a beginning. The day was overcast, and the air carried an unexpected chill, as if it sensed the tension of the meeting to come. Laura and Robert walked side by side, crossing streets that seemed emptier and quieter than usual. Each step felt heavier, and Robert kept his eyes on the ground, lost in thought. He knew where to find Cecilia. After all, she had been frequenting the same places for years. But even with that certainty, there was a fear he couldn't hide. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked hesitantly as they approached a poorly lit square where a row of benches was scattered, occupied by figures wrapped in blankets and worn-out clothes. "Cecilia? She's not easy, especially when it comes to Vincent." Laura took a deep breath, feeling the pressure build in her chest. "I'm sure," she replied firmly, but there was a softness in her voice that conveyed understanding. "I know she'll be resentful, maybe even furious, but I can't leave her like this, not if there's a chance to help." Robert nodded, though with some trepidation. He admired Laura's courage, even knowing that Cecilia wouldn't make things easy. A few minutes later, they reached the spot he knew well. At the far end of the square, near a solitary tree and a bench worn by time, Cecilia was sitting, wrapped in layers of faded clothes. Her gaze was lost, staring at the pavement in front of her, as if she were somewhere far, far away. "That's her," Robert whispered, pointing. Laura watched the woman for a moment. Cecilia looked older than her age suggested, as if the weight of the years and losses had stolen her youth before its time. Her hair, once well-groomed, was now tangled and hidden under a tattered beanie. She had the posture of someone carrying the world on her shoulders, and Laura immediately realized it wouldn't be easy to break through the barrier Cecilia had built. As they approached, Cecilia looked up, and her expression changed. At first, there was a flicker of surprise at seeing Robert, but then her eyes narrowed when she noticed Laura beside him. "What is she doing here?" Her voice came out harsh, almost like a growl. She stood up quickly, her anger and hurt evident in every movement. "She has nothing to do with this." Robert tried to intervene, his tone pleading. "Cecilia, please, we just want to talk." "Talk?" she snapped, her voice rising. "What is there to talk about? She thinks she can just show up and fix everything? Fix what, Robert? Vincent is dead." The words came out sharp, and Laura felt as if each one had hit her directly in the chest. Laura took a step forward, trying to stay calm. "Cecilia, I know this is hard," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I know you must have a lot of questions, many things that were never said, and I want to listen, I want to understand, so that maybe we can find a way to move forward." Cecilia laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, without joy. "Move forward? Do you think you can move forward after everything that happened? You, who took my son away from me?" Her eyes were fixed on Laura's, and the accusation was clear. "He drifted away because of you. You took him away from the family, made him believe he didn't need us, and then he died alone, and you let that happen." The intensity of Cecilia's words made Laura flinch, but she didn't look away. "It wasn't like that, Cecilia," she replied, struggling to maintain control. "I never wanted to keep him away from you. Vincent, he was struggling with things no one knew about. He felt pressured, lost, and we tried to find a way out together." "Lies!" Cecilia shouted, her voice almost breaking. "If he was so lost, why didn't he come to us? Why didn't he come home? Because you didn't let him, that's why. You pushed him away, and now he's gone." The tears began to stream down Cecilia's face, and her anger turned into a painful lament. "He's gone, and I'll never see him again." Robert tried to get closer, but he stopped when he realized that this was a pain he couldn't ease alone. Laura knew she needed to say something, but the words seemed stuck in her throat. She took a deep breath and chose the truth, even if it was hard. "He wanted to come back, Cecilia," she said, her voice choked. "He told me so many times that he wanted to make things right, that he wanted to find a way to fix what was wrong, but he was also afraid. He thought he had disappointed you, that there was no more room for him in the life you had planned, and that's what made him pull away, not because I stopped him, but because he didn't know how to deal with everything." Cecilia stared at her, her expression softening for a moment, as if she were trying to process what she had just heard. "He said that?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, vulnerable in a way Laura hadn't expected. "He did," Laura confirmed, moving closer slowly, as if she were afraid of scaring Cecilia. "He talked about you, about Robert. He talked about how he wanted to see you both happy, how he felt guilty for not being the son you expected. I also felt guilty many times for not being able to help him enough, to stop everything from ending the way it did. But I know he loved you, Cecilia. He never stopped loving you." Those words, simple but full of truth, seemed to pierce through Cecilia's defenses. She looked at Robert, who had been silent until then, watching everything with a sad expression. He nodded, as if to reaffirm Laura's words. Cecilia hesitated, her anger waning, but the pain still evident in her eyes. I didn't know," she whispered, tears now falling freely. "I just wanted him to know that there was still a place for him, that we still loved him. But he's gone, and I never got to say that." Laura felt a lump in her throat as she saw Cecilia's vulnerability. "I can't bring Vincent back," she said, moving closer until she was just a few steps away. "But we can honor his memory together. We can try to heal these wounds so that the pain he carried and the pain we still carry isn't in vain." Cecilia looked at her, her eyes shining with a mix of conflicting emotions. "And what do you hope to accomplish with this? Do you think you can give me some peace?" she asked, but her voice no longer had the same harshness as before. There was exhaustion in it, a desperate desire to believe in something, anything that might ease the pain that seemed endless. "I don't know," Laura replied honestly, "but I want to try. And maybe if we can forgive each other, if we can find a way to move forward, we can live in a way that honors Vincent's memory. He would want to see that, I'm sure." There was a long silence. Cecilia looked away, as if she was battling within herself, trying to decide whether to let in the small hope that Laura offered. Finally she sighed, exhausted, and her gaze met Laura's once more. "I don't know how," she admitted, "but maybe we can try." It was a beginning, even if a fragile one. Laura knew Cecilia's wounds wouldn't heal overnight, but that small act of opening up was enough to keep going. She hesitated, then extended her hand, and after a moment Cecilia took it, a light but firm grip. Robert watched the gesture, his eyes misty, knowing that this was a step he had hoped for so long. The morning was cold, and a light drizzle was falling, sprinkling the sidewalk with tiny, glistening drops. Laura was walking the same route she had taken days before, heading toward the square where she knew she would find Robert and Cecilia. After the tense and painful encounter, many people would have stepped back, accepting the resistance as an insurmountable barrier. But not Laura. Something in her heart, perhaps a mix of guilt and hope, kept her from giving up. She knew she had to try once more, and as many times as it would take. She carried a bag of groceries with her, a simple gesture that had gradually become part of her routine. When she arrived at the square, she saw Robert sitting next to Cecilia, who maintained her usual serious and distant expression. When Cecilia saw Laura approaching, she briefly looked up but quickly looked away, as if trying to avoid a confrontation. Still, she didn't get up to leave, and for Laura that was already a small sign of progress. "Good morning," Laura said, smiling gently as she placed the bag beside them. "I brought some things. I hope you like them." Her voice was calm but carried a certain caution, like someone trying to tread unknown ground without causing more damage. Robert smiled and nodded, always grateful for Laura's presence. He knew her persistence wasn't out of pity, but for something deeper, something he couldn't quite define. "Thank you, Laura," he said, as he began to take the items out of the bag. "You've been very kind." Cecilia didn't say anything, just watched out of the corner of her eye, as if trying to understand the intentions behind each of Laura's gestures. There was distrust there, but also curiosity, as if she was searching for a reason not to believe in the young woman's sincerity. Days passed, and Laura kept coming back. She never forced long conversations or tried to make Cecilia talk more than she wanted. Instead, she brought hot coffee in disposable cups, fresh bread, and sometimes even small sweets that Robert and Cecilia seemed to enjoy. Gradually, she began to share small details of her day, simple stories about what she saw on the way to the square or something funny she had heard. They were gestures that didn't demand responses, but created a sense of familiarity. Cecilia remained resistant, but something was changing. She still avoided prolonged eye contact, and her responses, when they came, were short and monosyllabic. However, her posture was no longer so defensive. Laura noticed that Cecilia listened, that she paid attention, even if she never commented. It was as if a part of her wanted to join in, but was still held back by something that kept her from fully opening up. One day, while Robert had stepped away to get something, Laura and Cecilia were left alone for a few minutes. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with unspoken things. Laura sat next to Cecilia, keeping a respectful distance, and finally spoke, her voice low and introspective. "I know it's still hard to trust me, and maybe I'll never be able to change what happened. But I'm here because I believe Vincent would want you and Robert to be happy, to find some peace." Cecilia didn't respond immediately. She looked off into the distance at the gentle sway of the trees in the wind, and then, almost without realizing it, she began to speak. "I just wanted him to know there was still a place for him, that he could come back." Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if she was speaking more to herself than to Laura. "But he never came back. And I feel like it was my fault." Laura's heart ached at those words. For the first time, she saw Cecilia allow herself to show a bit of her vulnerability, of her pain. "It wasn't your fault," Laura said softly. "He was afraid of not being accepted, afraid of disappointing you. And I feel guilty too, Cecilia. For years, I thought about how I could have done things differently, how I could have helped him more." Cecilia finally looked at Laura, her eyes brimming with tears, but without anger. "You say that, but I always thought he left because of you. He pulled away, and I thought, you took him away from us." Laura took a deep breath, feeling the weight of so many accusations and misunderstandings. He pulled away because he felt he needed to find a life that was his own. It wasn't easy for him. There were so many expectations, so many dreams that weren't his. And when he tried to explain, he felt he wouldn't be understood. "He told me about it, about the fear of disappointing you and Robert." Cecilia closed her eyes, and a tear rolled down her cheek. It was an old pain, but it still felt as sharp as the day it began. "I should have seen it. I should have done more." "We all think that way," said Laura gently. "We all think we could have done more, but Vincent never stopped loving you, never stopped caring. And maybe he wanted us to find a way to be happy even without him." For the first time, Cecilia seemed to take in those words. She didn't contest them, didn't pull away, just sat there in silence, letting their meaning envelop her. "I don't know if I can forgive myself," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can move on." Laura moved a little closer and carefully placed her hand on Cecilia's. "I don't know if I can forgive myself either," she confessed. "But I believe we can try, together, so that his memory isn't just pain, so that it can be something beautiful, something that brings peace instead of sorrow. Cecilia didn't respond, but she didn't pull her hand away. They stayed like that for a few minutes, sharing a moment of vulnerability and understanding. It was a first step, small and fragile, but significant. There was a lot to be overcome, but there, under the light drizzle and the grey sky, something seemed to have changed. A barrier had been broken, even if only subtly. When Robert returned, he found the two of them sitting side by side, their hands still joined, and something in his chest warmed. He knew the road ahead would be long, that there would be setbacks and difficulties, but that simple gesture already meant more than he dared to hope. Cecilia looked at him, and there was an expression he hadn't seen in a long time. It wasn't happiness, but a small, almost imperceptible acceptance. In the following days, Laura continued her visits, and little by little, Cecilia began to join the conversations, even if timidly. Robert noticed that she was more present, that her responses weren't just out of politeness. She even dared to ask Laura about her day, a small sign of interest that could easily go unnoticed, but that meant a lot to Laura. Small gestures of trust emerged, almost like timid sprouts appearing in once barren soil. Cecilia began to accept Laura's help without so much resistance, and she even allowed her to take some clothes to wash, something she had refused countless times before. Laura knew at that moment that she was on the right path, and that despite all the challenges, there was hope. The journey toward reconciliation was just beginning, and Laura knew she couldn't rush the process. But as Robert, Cecilia, and she walked together, even if slowly, she saw something new emerging, the possibility that one day the pain that united them could turn into a force that would heal them. The move to Laura's house happened on a sunny morning, as if the day was smiling at this small step toward a new beginning. Cecilia and Robert had finally accepted Laura's offer. It was a difficult decision for Cecilia, who still felt torn between distrust and hope. But deep down, she knew that staying on the streets, isolated and trapped in her pain, wouldn't bring Vincent back, nor would it erase the feelings that consumed her. Laura made sure everything was ready to welcome them, ensuring the environment was warm and inviting. The rooms were prepared with fresh bedding, and the open windows let the sunlight in, brightening the spaces. When they arrived, Cecilia hesitated at the entrance, stopping at the threshold as if this new reality was still a distant dream. Robert gently held her hand, firm and supportive, and together they crossed the threshold into Laura's home. The first week was about adjustment. Laura knew she couldn't rush things. Cecilia still maintained a certain reserve, as if she was waiting for something to confirm her fears, but little by little, she began to relax. The daily interactions brought about small routines that helped create a sense of normalcy. Early in the morning, Laura would make fresh coffee, and Robert would prepare toast, while Cecilia, a bit timidly, started helping by cutting up fruit. It was a simple division of tasks, but for them, it meant a lot. It meant they were together, working as a team, like a family. At night, they would gather around the dinner table, a ritual that Laura insisted on maintaining. The meals became moments of reconnection. At first, there was a bit of awkwardness, short conversations and fleeting glances, but over time, they began to open up more. Robert would share stories from his youth, funny and light-hearted moments that made Cecilia smile, something Laura observed with quiet joy. It was like seeing a piece of the dark cloud hanging over them dissipate a little. One night, during one of these dinners, Laura made a dish that Vincent used to love. She didn't mention it beforehand, but when they were all gathered, she said with a gentle smile, "Vincent taught me how to make this. He always said I never got the seasoning right, but he would eat it anyway." Her words took everyone by surprise, and for a moment there was silence. Then to Laura's surprise, Cecilia laughed. That's just like him. He liked to tease, but he never really complained. It was a short laugh, but sincere, and Laura realized they had taken another step forward. Life at Laura's house began to transform into a routine filled with small acts of kindness and mutual support. Little by little, Cecilia and Robert found ways to give back what they were receiving. Robert, always active, spent the mornings tending to the garden, an activity that brought him peace and distracted his mind from dark thoughts. He began planting flowers, and Laura joined him, listening to his stories as they planted together. Cecilia, on the other hand, started helping in the kitchen, and the afternoons turned into times for experimenting with new recipes, something Laura had always wanted to do, but never had the time for. As the days passed, Laura noticed something she hadn't seen in a long time. Cecilia seemed less tense. Her face still bore the marks of pain and suffering, but there were moments when she allowed herself to relax, where her smile would return, even if just briefly. One afternoon, while the two of them were folding freshly washed clothes, Cecilia confessed something that surprised Laura. "I still miss him every day, but I guess I never let anyone help me deal with it. I always thought I had to carry it alone." Laura looked at her and, with a sympathetic gaze, replied, "You don't have to anymore. We're here, together." These small moments of sharing were significant, almost imperceptible in their simplicity, but they represented enormous progress. It was as if they were slowly rebuilding their lives, brick by brick, with every smile, every shared memory, every story that brought Vincent's presence without making pain the center of everything. One of the most memorable moments in this process happened one afternoon in the garden. Laura had suggested that they all spend the day outside, enjoying the sun. Robert was planting some seedlings, while Laura and Cecilia set up a small area with chairs and cushions. After a while, the three of them sat down, and without anyone planning it, they began talking about Vincent. Robert, with his calm and nostalgic voice, spoke about when Vincent was a child, how he used to help in the garden, and the way his eyes would light up whenever something new blossomed. "He used to say that flowers were like little miracles," Robert said. "Maybe that's why he loved life so much, even when things were tough." Cecilia listened attentively, and after a long silence, she decided to speak too. "I always wondered if he knew he could come back, that we would be here for him, no matter what." Her voice was heavy with emotion, but she didn't cry. Instead, she looked at Laura. "Thank you for reminding me of that. I got lost in the pain, but you brought something back, something I thought was lost forever." Laura was touched by Cecilia's sincerity. "I got lost for a long time too," she admitted. "But being here with you both has made me realize that we can find pieces of happiness, even in the middle of sadness, and those pieces can help us move forward." Over time, Laura realized that the house had become a refuge, not just for Robert and Cecilia, but for herself as well. Taking care of them, sharing laughter, and even tears, allowed her to process her own pain in a way she had never been able to before. Laura realized that the presence of Robert and Cecilia was also healing her, filling a void she never thought could be filled. Cecilia, who at first was afraid to get attached to the new routine, began to see this shared life as something that strengthened her. Slowly, she understood that accepting Laura's help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a way to find a path forward. One morning, she suggested something that surprised everyone. "Maybe we should organize a dinner as a way to say thank you. I don't know exactly how, but I think it would be nice." It was a simple idea, but for Laura and Robert, it meant a lot. It was proof that Cecilia was allowing herself to embrace the new life, without forgetting Vincent, but also without drowning in his memory. She wanted to create something positive, something that celebrated the present and didn't just mourn the past. The dinner became a symbolic event, a milestone in the transformation they were experiencing. During the preparation, Cecilia and Laura laughed while chopping ingredients, and Robert, as always, took care of the flowers, filling the table with small arrangements he had picked from the garden. When the evening came, they all sat together and raised a toast. "To the memory of Vincent," said Robert, lifting his glass, "and to the strength that brought us here." The toast echoed through the house, and each of them felt the sincerity of that moment. There was still a lot to resolve, many scars that would take time to heal completely. But there, sitting together, they were living the beginning of a new story. A story where the pain didn't have to be forgotten, but where it could coexist with hope, with love, and with the promise that, even after so many losses, it was still possible to find joy. And so, the thread of hope that had seemed fragile at the beginning was now becoming stronger, more solid, weaving a new bond between Laura, Robert, and Cecilia, united by a love that, in a way, continued to live through them. The sun shone brightly that spring morning, as if nature itself was smiling to celebrate a special day. Inside Laura's house, a different energy hung in the air, a mix of anticipation, nervousness, and joy. It was Cecilia's birthday, and Laura had planned a special lunch to mark this new phase, an occasion that, for all of them, symbolized more than just a date on the calendar. It was an opportunity to leave behind the burdens of the past and embrace a new beginning. In recent months, Robert and Cecilia's lives had changed drastically. Laura's constant presence, the quiet routine, and the small gestures of care and understanding had slowly been healing the wounds that once seemed impossible to mend. Today, the house was no longer just Laura's. It was a shared home, where everyone contributed and, in their own way, found reasons to smile again. But Laura still had a secret, something she was anxiously waiting to share that day. Laura had spent the entire week organizing the details of the lunch. The table was set in the garden, decorated with flowers that Robert had carefully chosen and picked. Cecilia had helped in choosing the dishes and even suggested some old recipes she used to make for Vincent. It was a gesture that, for Laura, showed how much Cecilia was allowing herself to open up to new possibilities. She was, little by little, accepting the love and help surrounding her, and that was something worth celebrating. "You seem nervous," Robert said to Laura as they set the plates on the table. He looked at her with a gentle but curious gaze. "Is everything okay?" Laura smiled, trying to mask her anxiety. "I just want everything to go well today," she replied, adjusting a flower in the center of the table, but there was more to it than that. She knew the moment that was about to happen would be a turning point for all of them, and she couldn't contain the mix of emotions consuming her. Cecilia, who had remained quiet sitting near the table, looked at Laura and then at Robert. "Whatever you have planned, it will be special," she said, her voice calm but full of affection. "After all, you're the one behind it." It was a simple phrase, but full of meaning. For Cecilia, allowing herself to believe that someone was doing something for her out of love was a big step. When the clock struck noon, Laura asked everyone to take their seats. She paused, looking at Robert and Cecilia, and took a deep breath. It was time to reveal the secret she had kept for so long. "Before we start lunch, I'd like to introduce someone to you," she began, feeling her voice tremble slightly. "Someone very special, who has always been a part of my memories of Vincent, and who I hope can now be a part of all of our lives." Cecilia and Robert exchanged confused and curious glances, but they remained silent, waiting for Laura to continue. And then, from inside the house, a young boy appeared. He was about 9 years old, with slightly wavy brown hair and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. As he approached, he smiled shyly, as if he didn't quite know what to expect. "This is Thomas," Laura said, her voice filled with tenderness. "He's my son, and also Vincent's son." Laura paused briefly, observing the expressions of surprise on Robert and Cecilia's faces before continuing. "I found out I was pregnant shortly after Vincent passed," she explained, her voice thick with emotion. "It was one of the reasons the pain was so hard to bear. But I knew that, in some way, he would still be with me through Thomas. And now I would like for him to be a part of your lives too. I want him to know the grandparents that Vincent loved, even though he never got the chance to express it." The impact of those words was immediate. Cecilia brought her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise, while Robert seemed to be trying to grasp what he had just heard. "Vincent's son," Cecilia susurrava, quasi in discrenza. The words echoed like something she never thought she would hear. Laura nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "I discovered I was pregnant not long after we lost him," she explained, her voice choked with emotion. "That's one of the reasons why the grief was so hard to bear, but I always felt that somehow he would still be with me through Thomas. And now I want him to be part of your lives too. I want him to meet the grandparents that Vincent loved, even if he never got to say it." Cecilia stood still for a moment, as if Laura's words needed time to penetrate her heart. Then her eyes filled with tears, and she began to cry in a way she hadn't allowed herself to for a long time. Robert's eyes were also wet, but it was a silent cry, one of relief and joy. He looked at Thomas and saw something familiar in the boy. A smile, a sparkle in his eyes, something that immediately reminded him of Vincent when he was a child. "My God, he looks just like Vincent when he was little," Cecilia whispered, her voice breaking with sobs. She stood up and walked over to Thomas, kneeling down to be at his level. "Hi, Thomas," she said, with a smile that seemed to come from the depths of her heart. "I'm your grandmother, and I'm so happy to meet you." Thomas, who had been shy at first, smiled and threw himself into Cecilia's arms, as if he instinctively knew that was where he belonged. It was a hug that lasted long seconds, but it seemed to hold years of unspoken feelings, of pains that were finally being released. Robert joined the hug, placing his hand on the boy's head, with a paternal tenderness that seemed to want to make up for all the love he had been holding on to, without knowing whom to give it to. Laura, watching the scene, let her own tears fall, feeling that, at last, something was healing inside her. After the emotional moment, everyone sat down at the table, and the lunch began. The atmosphere was light, full of smiles and spontaneous laughter. Cecilia, who used to withdraw during moments of celebration, seemed more alive than ever. She asked Thomas questions, eager to know everything about him, what he liked, what he dreamed of. Robert, for his part, watched every interaction with an expression of contentment, as if witnessing a miracle happening right before his eyes. During the meal, Laura shared little stories about Vincent that she had never told before, and this time the memories didn't bring only pain, but also a sense of peace and joy. Thomas listened attentively, smiling and laughing at the stories that made him imagine the father he never got to know, but who now, through the words and gestures of everyone there, seemed more present than ever. At the end of the lunch, Robert raised his glass for a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice strong but filled with emotion. "To the moments that give us a second chance at happiness, and to Vincent, who lives on through all of us, and especially through Thomas." Everyone raised their glasses, and the toast was followed by a chorus of smiles and exchanged glances that carried a silent promise that from now on they would be a family, united not by the past that had separated them, but by the future that brought them together. The day passed easily, and as the sun began to set, bathing the garden in a golden light, they all sat together on the grass, savoring the moment. Cecilia held Thomas's hand, and Robert sat beside them, his arm around Laura. She looked at all of them and felt, for the first time in a long while, a deep sense of peace. Not because the pain of losing Vincent had disappeared, but because, through Thomas, she had found a new way to love and honor his memory. The presence of the boy was like a new beginning, a promise that life goes on, and that it's possible to find happiness even after the greatest losses. Thomas, with his energy and curiosity, was living proof that the love Vincent had left in the world was still blooming and would continue to flourish. The sun finally dipped below the horizon and the night fell, but inside Laura's house, the light had never shone so brightly. Because now, together, they were not just people connected by the pain of loss, but a new family, united by hope, by love, and by the desire to move forward, to heal and to live. And so, amidst laughter, memories, and looks full of affection, they began a new chapter. A chapter that did not deny the past, but chose to look forward toward a future where the memory of Vincent was not just a shadow, but a light guiding each of them toward better days. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.